when you're first writing, you're kind of trying to, the smart thing to do is what I'm going to try all this out. I'm going to try all these different forms out, the short story, the creative essay. I'm not still much one for the personal essay. I will say I have a number of more scholarly pieces that have a slight personal edge. Just because, I have the PhD and when I scratch that itch, that's what happens. But yeah, and then poetry just died. And I think it was because I just always had one foot more firmly in fiction. And what was going on was I was very interested in gritty, reality. I also at the same time took it very seriously, this idea that to be a serious writer, you could not write about elves. And so these books were like, they were about the urban Indian experience, right? And they were also about lots of other things, family dynamics, what it's like in a group of friends, even and one of my last novels before I turned to a big five press, right? Was about Native gangs, which isn't talked very much down here. And overall, I was always trying to be very, take a lot of poetic and imaginative license. Just because you come from a certain background doesn't mean you're not crafting your work and really hard. But one thing I always tried to make sure that people understood is that urban Indians are not just Indians that maybe their father or grandfather, were in a relocation program and ended up in a big city. Urban Indians are a untalked about community of whom some are like that, right? Or some are from a reservation and they've made their way and stayed in Minneapolis. But a lot of us are in Minneapolis, Denver, Albuquerque, and we're often a combination of tribes who have never lived on reservations and have come together through urban Indian things like powwow, like Native American church, other community things. And we're a much maligned, very little talked about group. And so I worked very hard to make sure there was an organic vision of that in all my work. But the other part of it was a lot of where people, when I was coming of age as a writer, were slotting anything speculative, the word that we're using now, when it came to writers of color, was this thing called magical realism. And I really didn't identify with that, right? It would be like, Toni Morrison's a master, but that wasn't my thing. Like, I wasn't that writer, Louis Erdrich, absolutely a genius. Okay. But something about that whole, it's not science fiction, there's not a space station, but it's not gritty realism. That, you know what I mean? Like, it just didn't work for me. And I think eventually why I ended up with White Horse was because I thought, okay, supposedly the ghost is a metaphor if it's literary, or the ghost isn't real, or the ghost is just we have to believe in it because it's part of my cultural background. Well, what if the ghost is real? What if the ghost is actually real? And what if I'm literary anyway? What if literary isn't a genre? What if it's a series of conventions like depth of characterization, or depth of theme, complex characterization, attention to form and language. And I can do all those things at the same time and still have all the cool stuff I love, like magic mirrors or, demonic presences or monsters. And so I wanted to do those things at the same time. And it came together for me in horror. And the other part of that was, I think there are people who think like that again, like, oh, and they're Native people who think it. Like, you just say you're Native American and somehow you get your stuff published. That was not the case for me for 20 years. Okay. It was not the case. Like, it turns out writing is hard, number one. Actually putting together an entire novel, whether you're doing it in a sort of unstructured way or a structured way, is hard. And getting someone to publish you, especially when in the 90s, there was a very similar thing going on to what there is now, which is this pretendian panic. Because like now, there's this huge swell in Native American fiction, poetry, and people are starting to pay attention to us. And boop, in came the damp. This authenticity measure was there and natives were participating in it. And there was this, last guy standing because he was the most authentic. He was from a res. Both his parents were Native. He was poor. He was tradish. And it was Alexi. And look what he did with that power. So right now it's happening again, this like big thing where it's like push down, because we're actually gaining incredible ground in TV, in film, in fiction. And that is the world that I have been building for 20 years. For 20 years, I've reached out to other Native writers, built community, continued, to say, what can I do? how can we change the culture? What can I refer you to an agent? Even if I don't have one. And so writing articles for LitHub, for BuzzFeed, over and over and over, so that people understood it could be all of us at once, and they might be able to read our work because, oh, wow, that story actually sounds interesting. Not, I've just got to check mark my one Native American off the list. The whole collection started when I was quite young. I was writing a short story collection called White Horse Love. And there's a bar called the White Horse in Denver that was became an Indian bar. It started in the 30s. In the 60s, it was solidly an Indian bar. And I went there many times before it closed during the pandemic. And there were lots of cats there. And it's this great place. And so I imagine all these different couples at different points in time meeting at the White Horse, all these Indian couples. And then, it changed a lot over time. And then I was even trying my hand at a science fiction novel, which bombed. And I was like, what if I tried to make this mess into a novel? And it was a mess. The result was it was a mess. And at that time, my reading life had gone from realism, or what people call literary, to speculative, to then it became more and more speculative until I was barely reading any of it. And I was mainly reading horror. I was mainly reading fantasy and science fiction again. And so when I rewrote this novel over and over, the last few incarnations, it was a horror novel because it was more fun. And it also, it was a lot of talking in a room is the problem. And it was really boring when it was realism, because I was trying to recount the main character's mother's experiences. So making it so that the main character is haunted by her mother, and the mother is actually, the main character is living her mother's experiences, was a much more organic, fun, cool way to do that. And I even tried a multiple point of view novel at one point. Boy, I bombed with that. So, and the other part of it was my grandmother was a woman who experienced a lot of racial discrimination in her life, a lot of discrimination in general. She had an arranged marriage when she was young. And he beat her, he gave her syphilis. She recovered from it, but she, when she left him, she married his friend, who was, always a fan of hers, obviously. And she recovered from syphilis as much as one can, because the cure was in 1928. And my mother was born in 1939. So, and she had, her children with her, my grandfather. And the rumor was, right, and I barely got to know my mother. At first, it was my grandmother committed suicide. Then later, a friend of my mom's had looked at the death certificate and said, this looks kind of doctored. And I know your dad was kind of well respected in the community. Unfortunately, this might be a murder. And so that tension, right, especially thinking about how my mother as an urban Indian, so there are some people who would argue, right, unless you're from a reservation, you can't be counted as missing and murdered and indigenous. But the community did believe my grandfather, because even though he probably had some Black and Native descent, he basically passed for white, whereas my grandmother was a Native person. And it didn't matter whether she had family on the rolls or not. She was a brown, clearly Native person. And whatever happened, which again, the tension for that, my family has been big. He was believed. And so I think that was part of the novel. Yeah. Overall, I think, right, being a writer is kind of like being a mechanic. You don't get to have the fun driving the car. You just know how the car operates end to end, right? You pull it apart. So that was a question. When my agent took the novel, it was missing that fear factor. And so what I did was I looked at The Ring. I looked at Conjuring, that series that I loved. I looked at The Cell. I looked at the Paranormal Activity novel, films. And I thought, because film is just really visceral when it comes to horror, right? There's a lot of B garbage out there, but there's a lot of stuff that's very effective. And so I really sat down and wrote down every single moment that scared me and why it scared me, how it scared me. And I realized in some ways it has to do with gradual, right, scaring. You'll see this in the Paranormal Activity. They'll be like, I don't remember putting this pen here. And then in the next scene, you can see the pen slightly roll by itself and fall off the table, but it could be something, could be the wind, right? And it escalates in this slow, dramatic way until you're actually terrified, and it's fabulous. So yeah, that's what I did. The hard part about being a writer is that when you're a kid, you think it's about talent, and then you think it's about ambition. And what I'm learning now it is about endurance. So it was tremendously exciting and ridiculously nerve-wracking and wild when I was on Good Morning America, wild, when I got a singular review in the New York Times. Believe me, and Laura Vandenberg couldn't be, she's a great writer, but she's so cool. Like, she's just a cool person. So that was wonderful.